This is an image of two Azande women and an Azande man. And this image is very interesting because it shows the Azande, who are also the Azande, who are also known as Nyam Nyam. These people here are very interesting, especially when it comes to their war tactics. Now, they don't generally wear armor, but they have some very interesting weapons, like the throwing knife. This throwing knife, which of course is unknown to a lot of people, which some people, some books from early Portuguese call it a strange dagger. And so they understood it to be a knife when asking the locals about what it was. In this unclear image, this man with his other hand, which he gets many interpretations of the same person. One, he is holding the knife in his hand, but it doesn't look like it here. And the other, he's holding a giant shield, which is typical of the Zande people. By the way, the Zande people are a Bantu group of people, and they exist mainly in Congo, but they also exist in Sudan in large numbers, about 1 million. This warlike tribe, which is actually funny from Congo because almost every tribe in that area is warlike, but this warlike tribe is exceptional in how it could behave. And of course, the weapons of choice gave them an advantage that actually made other people employ them when it came to taking out their enemies. And of course, their ability to expand and move in large groups was one of their biggest advantages. Now, of course, you can see there they carry assegais too. This episode is going to be image heavy, so if you only listen, make sure you look at the screen. So a lot of the images that I will provide will be about different military stuff, but I will also be showing some carvings that these people made. So this is the image of the same young man, and you can see this time clearly that he is holding this dagger or throwing knife, which can be used to throw, but it can also be used at a short distance. And of course, when he's carrying his shield, it will make him even more effective because he can hide behind the knife, well, hide behind the shield and throw the knife. Now, that's one of the things that I've noticed about this specific area, Central Africa in general, is that a lot of the times they rely on their offensive more than their defensive when it comes to weaponry, that they arm themselves so much that obviously the enemy they were facing was a little different than what would come later, that they have a deep advantage than a lot of the other people. And then, of course, when you add that with numbers, shields can only do so much. This is the original painting of that little boy's image, and it comes from a collection of paintings of people from around the world, warriors from around the world, whether it's fighters from Ethiopian Mogadishu or whether it's Polynesian fighters. But my favorite image is the next one that features a Native American man. It's actually so well made, in my opinion. So now let's go back to the Azande. So the Azande, as I mentioned, were a very militarist people. And because of that, they were used in several places. You can even see images of very young boys, like the image that I showed, of them arming themselves at very young ages. Now, as I mentioned, this image would be reproduced over and over again, one with a shield. And with a shield that size, you can imagine how, and of that make, you can imagine how this person is fully protected. Now, it's interesting what he's wearing because this is typical warrior gear within the Angolan sort of Congo region. And as I mentioned, they did have some skin they would put on their body in some parts, but in some parts, they would take off stuff that could act as armor and put some other stuff on. But as I mentioned, this is because they had other things to worry about, like being very offensive, being aggressive to the point of victory. And it worked because they had extremely large armies. So now let's generalize the weapons to just any of the tribes over there. You can see here the different makes of spears and how some of them would have been better for short stabbing, while some were better for throwing. Obviously, the ones with better gliders are going to go further when it comes to throwing. Now, here's the things. Typically, weapons like these are not going to be the most effective when it comes to having a shield of that size and of that make again. So, how did they get around this? How did the people in the Congolese areas approach someone, approach a group of people with shields, without shields, although the enemy would be hindered and they wouldn't be able to use things like bow and arrows effectively? What did they do to make sure that they could go around stuff like that? Well, in the writing that we have, they provide us hooked weapons that could pull back and remove the shield from an opponent. These weapons over here by the Portuguese are called musokolo. And the reason they're called that is because they are used in fighting against typical African weaponry. And these weapons, which is a wide variety of weapons that kind of look like this is the ones that use, so you grab, you basically put it beyond the shield at the top or bottom, and then you just pull, and it's used to get someone. This is, again, it's long so that you can do this from a safe distance, and it is different than the shorter version of it, which is used to execute um criminals or whoever, especially people of war who have committed treason of some kind. The people who carried these were the typical people of the Congolese fold, and they did not just carry those type of weapons only, musokolo only. They had bow and arrows, which were ready to kill. They had short spears. They had poisoned arrows. They had a tiny shield, as you can see there, that's made of skin, very different than the one of the Zande people. And when they were in action, they were in action. And you can imagine being a warrior standing there with your giant shield. Think about it. When they lose their shield, they don't have any armor on. So when they lose their shield, they're completely exposed. You can imagine trying to go to war for the first time and you've never seen this weapon before. And as soon as you try to fight the person, he just pulls your shield back. You thought you were safe behind your shield. He pulls the shield back, and while you're looking, he just maybe drops this weapon and pulls out another and puts an end to you, or really uses the front part to end your life. Because you can see the front part is quite dangerous. Now you can see that some of them are less dangerous and more used for pulling and all of that. Like the three in the middle, you can see that they're less sharp than the others. This unsettling looking figure here is actually not a warrior, but he is a kind of warrior. What he is an inspector, and these type of inspectors, who you can see to some degree have a level of anonymity, they actually stand at the door of important areas and important halls. And as it says at the bottom, it's in Portuguese, so I translated it. Um, it says at the bottom that they were responsible for the cleanliness of roads. So if you see a road that is clean in some of those drawings, someone like this would be standing at the door of that road. and that the door of a house that belongs to a very important person. Now, I don't know if that mask was used for anything else outside of just hiding the person's face and obviously religious symbolic and also cultural significance. But it is a interesting sight. And of course, for the foreign person, there is probably more people to be frightened of in that village than just some guy wearing a wooden mask. These are adorned weapons, and admittedly, most of these come from work tools, even though they can be used as weapons, as is described. And you can see that they're, adorned very well. So I don't know how much battle these would see, or even how much work they would see if you just talk about working. Now, some of the curving blades, the Portuguese guy says, but I don't know, some of the curving blades, he says that a lot of that curve came from cutting grass. And so the way that they would do like a sickle of some kind, they use that to cut grass. And then they came up with the concept of using it in battle. Now, this is not necessarily a weapon of war. In fact, it's a piece used by people who make weapons or make iron things. And a lot of these were used in picking out in the flaming process of making weapons. And in fact, you can see there that one can attach to a rope and the other can attach to a stick, and then it can be used for battle in some cases, but they typically do not have a sharp end. You can see they're kind of rounded off, and so they're kind of useless in battle. They're used mainly for cutting things, as you can see the sort of grooves on the side. According to this Portuguese, in Lunda, they call these apaka, these type of knives. In fact, they say that's the general word for the word knife, and that there's another word which means knife of the forgers, which they use even when they use a military grade knife, because it's built in the same way that the military grade, that the tool is used. In this passage, he analogizes the comb, right, a comb on the head, with a fork and with a knife. And they say, by the way, not a fork and knife, but a fork, because in this place they used a fork, a type of fork. It's basically a knife, but they used a type of fork to eat food. And the way that they explain this in this part is that chizangilo is the tool that they use, the fork like tool, knife, that they use to get coal out of the way when creating iron. If you look at the last sentence, you will see that they compare this to eating food. They say chamaran, chizangela, uwa kudila or gudela, which means gudela, which means to eat. So a fork for eating compared to a fork for forging versus a fork for war. And as I said, these forks to some degree basically are like knives. These knives may look impractical, but believe me, they are more than practical. And their heads are big and long, which is weird. The size that we're given is that they're 0.7 meters, so 70 centimeters long. That's about two rulers, two 30-centimeter rulers. The people who had these weapons are called Mwatunya, and they traveled with these giant knives. But these people were a offshoot of the Lunda, The Lunda and the Mwadunya have two things in common. One, the because the Mwadunya came from the Lunda are known as the knife people because of these large knives, but the Mwadunya are known as the rock throwers. So they throw rocks at their enemies during war, and you put those together and you get throwing knives. These wooden structures are not weapons in themselves. Instead, they operate like papooses, but for knives. Basically, a sheath, but it also doubles down because it's also described as something to sit on. You can imagine how big it must be for the person to be able to sit on one of these. Of course, there are arrows, and a lot of these arrows would be made of some metal at the tip, but a lot of the times they could be made of just about anything, depending on the wealth of your society in that specific region. The wealthier regions would use metal, others would use stone, others would use wood. They just sharpen the wood. But as you can see here, this is not sharpened wood. The most dangerous part about these is that they would then be tipped with poison, which is pretty much instant death. Well, not instant, but it's certified death for a person. Even if it just merely scratches you, you're gonna die. Now, remember, a lot of these societies, they knew how to get rid of certain poisons, or they had antivenom of some kind. They knew how to do that. So it's possible that some people survived even after they'd been hit. So what you're looking at here is an axe being used as a garden hoe. And as you can see at the bottom, again, you're going to have to translate it. It is written that instead of a garden hoe, they would use these axes because when attacked, they also double down as a weapon. Unfortunately, there's not a full English translation of this, so I had to use AI. Some have slightly pronounced curve at the top. The curve is used to create counterweight that balances with the iron. This iron being round tapers towards the edge, which they always keep very sharp, having a spike on the back side that fits into a hole, and the side opposite the counterweight. The edge is 0.02 to 0.04 inches long. This axe is often used in farming instead of a hoe, and it is always used because it also serves as a weapon. The example I am showing is ornamented and the blade is very smooth. Now, this is the thing that people don't know about this, which is, there's a lot of situations. By the way, the throwing knife and even those other knives that I talked about, they're used a lot by assassins, and they're used a lot by people who are marketing because you're allowed to carry those just about anywhere. Not the throwing knife, but the hooked knives. Having shown most of their weapons, we will get to other things that this book talks about. It took me a while to read this, but this book is actually one of the most fantastic because it's from a pre-colonial time, and it depicts wilderness next to civilization, and that is probably the best thing about it. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you. The next video, I'm going to try to react to some guy who tried to pretend that there's no such thing as rollers and no such thing as paper in other countries except for China for some reason in ancient times. For those of you who stuck around for the last few minutes, thank you very much as well. Highly appreciated. I'm going to drop like 3 other images here for you to see, which shows what these people wore in the pre-colonial times and what they were doing back in the day.